minutes as everyone sort of crashes in from other webinars or having something to eat or whatever it is. Colonel, you're a Royal Anglian regiment, so from the east of England, where I'm based. I'm in Norwich at the moment.
Anglian, you said, I think. Yes, closer. Yes, Royal Anglian. Yeah, yeah.
Sorry, I did
Norwich
say that
is well within our recruiting area.
Yeah, it's great actually. Yeah, and very active in Afghanistan. I think is it 3 battalions that were involved? I'm not sure.
We only had 2 battalions by the time Afghanistan started, but both went there. And our 1st battalion actually, I think, was one of the most one of the units in the army that did more tours than anybody else out there, and indeed have been out there until quite recently. And the 2nd battalion now has a company in Mali.
Oh, really? Yes, helping the French.
No, they're actually with the UN with the Light Dragoons. We have Chinooks out with the French.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And heavy lift aircraft, I thought. So they were short of those. That was my understanding. So we actually helped with some of the American aircraft we have.
Yeah. And now there's a degree of enthusiasm to get some Chinooks out to join the UN element, because they don't have any longer have their own integral air capability. Well, they don't have helicopter capability anyway, and there's concern obviously over logistics, and in particular Kasabak in Mali, because they're operating over very long distances.
And Al-Shabaab are doing some evil things, aren't they? They're very active, it seems.
Yeah, and so I mean, 7 members of the UN force in Mali have been killed in just the last few weeks. So it's a very dangerous operation, that one.
Yeah, it's very sad. Just waiting for the go ahead. Harrison, if you can hear me, I hope you can. Can we go ahead? If you hit 70.
Saying 63 on mine at the moment.
63, right. Oh, that's right. Yeah. Just leave it 1 more minute. Then we'll kick off.
How's the Defence and the Intelligence and Security Committee, Julian? Is it keeping you busy?
Yes and no, in the sense that obviously we're limited by the fact that we can't meet virtually. And so although there are a number of debates going on the floor of the House and virtually, which we're participating in, to do with legislation on national security and investment, and telecom security bill is another one. But obviously some of the other work that we do is in suspension at the moment, unfortunately. So we'll have plenty to do when this lockdown eventually lifts.
Yeah. I wouldn't expect you to comment, but I would imagine that the intelligence services, the ones that don't use just signals intelligence, have found quite a challenge in this current situation as well, with inability to chat, to meet, and often inability to meet and to travel. Well,
that's a deduction that you might draw. Whether it would be an accurate one or not, I can't say.
You wouldn't like to comment.
You might say that. I couldn't possibly comment.
Okay, if we can call the meeting to order now, I think we've got most people have had a chance to log in. So thank you so much for coming and attending the latest Freedom Association webinar in a series on the very important aspect of defence and security. And we've got some excellent speakers tonight, very high quality speakers. I think we should start just by noting the sad news, obviously, tonight. The captain, Sir Tom Moore, has passed away at 100. Sad news with COVID complications. I think we all feel that he was an incredible inspiration at a very difficult time for all of us. And personally, I think his values and his value system were amazing. And, he really showed us some leadership in terms of values. So on that sad note, if we can pass on, I was just going to say a few words from my own aspect. I don't have the wonderful military experience that our main speakers have tonight, but I was in the Territorial Army for 3 years, university, including a year attached to the Royal, the ROTC, not the Royal, the Reserve Officers Training Corps in the United States and University of Pennsylvania, which is very interesting. In the European Parliament, I was on the Security and Defence Subcommittee, so we dealt with things like Somalia, piracy and peacekeeping operations. And I went to visit Northwood. Ironically, the UN HQ, sorry, not the NATO HQ, was 100 yards literally away from the EU HQ on the same site. So it did make me worry about duplication. I was Northern Ireland peace process, so I know what it's like to be on a death list. I was on the IRA death list. I was involved in that. And I was chairman of the Iraq delegation in the European Parliament. So I went to visit the front line opposite ISIS controlled Mosul with the Peshmerga, the wonderful Kurdish forces, very brave. And it was interesting to see the sort of massive damage around that area, which air power had brought. They brought down the main motorway to Erbil, protected Erbil, destroyed a lot of the village. It was empty. So I've got a feel of military power and how it's been applied. I would just say during the EU referendum, it was said that it was a nonsense to talk about an EU army and all of that. That wasn't true. I mean, we've seen PESCO arise since the referendum. That is the permanent structured headquarters of an EU army. And that's real and is up and running. And we have these EU brigades as well. So, all the elements, I believe, are there. And, we all have different views about that. Defense, obviously, is very critical. And it's part and parcel of foreign and security policy. They're very intimately linked, hence the combining that tonight. And I'm personally glad we have a prime minister and a government that finally, after 30 years, I think it is prepared to spend more on defence. Hallelujah. Is my reaction, because 2% is really not enough in my view. I know Julian, as a stalwart member of the Freedom Association, Julian Lewis has called for 3%, and I would like to see 3.5%, which is the same proportion as the United States. But obviously that is difficult in economic circumstances. So the opportunities of leaving the European Union foreign policy as well is interesting. China, the EU is doing this deal with China. It's getting rather close to China. We could take a different view, and Iran, particularly, I'm very worried about the destabilization of the entire Middle East, like Yemen, Bahrain, Iraq. I saw firsthand by the Iranians, this nuclear deal does free up $100 billion or more for, I think, terrorist operations, which is very concerning. And finally, the Commonwealth, I think it's a real opportunities. I met the Australian Governor General just after the Australians had actually ordered some British built or designed frigates. And I think, military procurement on a Commonwealth basis, I mean, China's threat to India on its border, Australia, New Zealand, potentially. And then, of course, we were talking earlier about Africa, Kenya and Nigeria, and threat from Islamic jihadists. We can cooperate on that. And Mali, working with the French. But the Commonwealth angle is a very interesting one. So on that basis, I'm delighted to welcome our panel. And I'm going to ask our very own speaker, Tim Scott, who is treasurer of the Freedom Association, and will ask me to say that if you want to make a contribution, do please go to, or join us, go to tfa.net. And please, because that helps to fund these kind of events. But Tim is also captain, Tim Scott. He was in Cyprus and Northern Ireland with the Queen's Fusiliers. And he's got a few ideas from the Freedom Association point of view, just to set the scene before we ask our main speakers to speak. So Tim, would you like to go ahead?
David, thank you very much. And just give me a wave if you can hear me. So that should be good. Thank you. And thank you for having me on, and great to be on the panel with Julian Lewis and Colonel Richard. David, what was it Nick Clegg said about an EU army? A dangerous fantasy, I seem to remember he called it. Perhaps he can pontificate that from his vice presidential position with Facebook in California. But I did, those of you who are members, and I'm sure as Treasurer you'll allow me a plug for the finances, may have seen Free Nation, which you either get posted or emailed to you. And I did have an article, such as it was, in Free Nation. So do visit that. You can get it online if you don't get it posted to you when you are a member. If you aren't a member, do join us, of course. And I think it's ever more relevant because we live in an ever more uncertain and multipolar world. And one of the principles, one of the founding principles, in fact, of the Freedom Association is strong national defence. And that's a great principle. And by that we mean defences that can provide the security that we need, that are independently deployable, and that are not dependent upon any other country. And I was trying to say with what I wrote that our armed forces, like Britain herself, are forces for good in the world. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But also that just to point out that national security and defence are the first duty of any government. And I think this government gets that. Although I'm not entirely sure about previous governments, but I think the main thing is I think this government very definitely gets that. And it's not just about providing defence and security. It's interesting to note, who does the government turn to in times of trouble? Apart from times of war and conflict. And the armed forces provide both the regulars and the reserves. I did a bit in both, that they provide the army, they provide the government with a source of emergency manpower. So you may remember the foot and mouth outbreak from back in the day. You may remember when we didn't have enough guards for the Olympics in 2012, various floods and dams about to burst. And of course, now with vaccine distribution and logistics, who does the army get asked by? Who do the politicians and the government turn to? It's of course the armed forces are there as a ready-made reserve, and they can deliver. They do deliver in times of trouble. Tony Blair always used to say that when he asked the forces to do something, he always got a good positive result, whereas if he asked other people, he get a list of excuses why it couldn't be done. So, but of course, it all has to be paid for, and there is the 2%, 3% of GDP debate about how we fund it. One of the things Trump did get right, he didn't get everything right, of course. One of the things Trump did get right was calling out the NATO freeloaders, those not spending the minimum 2%. Germany's probably the worst offender. Biggest economy in Europe, and it's only spending about 1.3. And they had the nerve to complain to America about withdrawing their troops from Germany. Well, how about getting some of your own troops? But this government, and I'll let Julian Lewis talk more about the very welcome increase in funding that the government have just announced. It's really great to hear that. So this fits into the Army's footprint, and particularly I think the Navy, which is I think the most relevant service to global Britain. It really fits into the whole global Britain agenda and British influence around the world. And like I know David is, I'm a huge fan of CANZA, the Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK potential alliance, which would have, it wouldn't just be a great defense and security partnership, it would have 7% of the world's economy and would be a great advocate for human rights, democracy, free trade, but it would be a great defense combination as well. And there are others that we can work with around the globe as well, not just the USA and NATO, of course, but I think Kenya and Nigeria are two big African countries we've identified. We've got a permanent training facility in Kenya and a training team in Nigeria. I don't know if people caught it, but just before we came on, we were talking about the British troops that we've got in Mali. And I think also we can be working, and we should be working with some of the Sunni Muslim majority countries. Historically, we've had great links historically with Jordan. Let's not forget Israel, of course, the West's most steadfast ally in the Middle East. So these are all people that we can be working with. This is all good stuff, and that we can do. Now, the numbers are much reduced, of course, and but that's not entirely unwarranted. But it is partly unwarranted, I think. We've got we no longer need 10,000 troops in Northern Ireland, 20,000 troops in West Germany. But if you look at our footprint of bases, we've got a very good footprint of bases. Cyprus is probably the best example, 3,000 troops there, 2 infantry battalions, a really good airfield, an RAF Akrotiri, and others. We've got troops in Mali, still got a garrison in the Falklands, Gibraltar. Many of these are legacies of empire, of course. And we've got a relatively new base in the Middle East, HMS Jufair on Bahrain, with the Navy trying out something a little bit new, a little bit different, with ships based out there and the crew rotated through every 4 months by just flying out by plane, and the ship stays there. That seems to be working. There's just a couple of other things I'd like to really just point out. One is the great work done by Johnny Mercer, and I'm very grateful to the government for taking up this issue of prosecution of our troops, some might say persecution of our troops, dating back to the days of Ballymurphy in Northern Ireland, but Iraq and Afghanistan too. And this really has got to stop. And the example I always use is the South Armagh sniper gang, who under the Good Friday Agreement only served 18 months for at least a dozen killings. And I think just the last thing to comment on really is the very welcome COVID and lockdowns allowing, the very welcome deployment of the new carrier Queen Elizabeth II, which will go through the Gulf, round to Japan and back. That's due in May, with a couple of frigates, a couple of destroyers, and some supply ships, and almost certainly a submarine. So that's getting some global Britain back on the agenda. So yeah, I'm proud of our armed forces. I have an almost boyish enthusiasm for all things defence and security. So that's really what I wanted to say. I think post-Brexit, there's very exciting opportunities for our country. I've just before I came on, somebody posted on Twitter, Hugh Grant telling us that Brexit was a catastrophe and the country's finished. Well, I say we're only just getting started, and our armed forces are very much part of that. So thank you, David. That's I'm sure we'll have questions later, but I'll let the others have a go now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim, for that. I'd like to turn now to Colonel Richard Kemp, who I follow on Twitter, and there's some great shots there of you 91 in the Gulf. I was looking at those recently. And he served with the British Army 1977 to 2006, did 8 tours of Northern Ireland, and was wounded in the multiple terrorist mortar attack in that very same South Armagh, the bandit country. He took command of British forces in Afghanistan in 2003, and then spent 5 years later in Downing Street as head of the International Terrorist Team, the Joint Intelligence Committee, very vital role with assessments and growing terrorist threats. So we're very honoured to have him. Thank you, Colonel. And could you give us a few words? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, David. I think before I start to make the comments I was planning to make, I'd like to take up one point that that Tim mentioned just then, relating to troops prosecutions. And it's been in the news recently over investigations and potential prosecutions over Northern Ireland. And I think it's been revealed that a further 12 veterans are being investigated now with a view to charging them for alleged criminal offences half a century ago, incredibly. And these are just the latest on a long, long list of investigations, which amount in many ways to persecutions of soldiers, because at this range, with no new evidence available, the potential for conviction of any of them, even if they were guilty of the offences, is extremely low. And so it is really, I believe, a campaign by Sinn Féin to change history, to turn the armed forces into oppressors and their own terrorists into freedom fighters. And I'm a member of a group called Veterans for Britain, which is chaired by Julian Thompson, General Julian Thompson, who commanded the Marines in the Falkland Islands. And we put in a Freedom of Information request recently, which we've got answered today, about how many investigations are being mounted against IRA terrorists or other terrorists who killed British troops in Northern Ireland. The answer came back, as I say today, 0, none. And I think that what that shows is that we're not talking about anything approaching a level playing field. We're talking about a very successful campaign by Sinn Féin, which is consuming all of the police historical investigations teams' resources on trying to get British troops into the dock. I just thought I'd mention that one because it is sort of breaking news.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Turning to the issue of defence after Brexit. I mean, Brexit clearly brings a number of potential advantages to UK defence. And I think the first very distinct advantage is that we've managed to escape from an organisation that seeks greater and greater central power over member states in its mission to acquire superpower status. This includes, of course, the desire that David mentioned earlier and Tim has mentioned also, for what the EU calls its European Defence Union, or in more colloquial terms, the non-existent EU army, denied by so many for so long. And this has long been on one of their many goals. And while a member of the EU, Britain publicly resisted such moves, at the same time, with varying degrees of knowledge by British politicians, British officials were working to enmesh the EU into a range of the UK rather, into a range of EU structures, working towards this EU army, this phantom army. And this they continue to do, the officials I'm talking about now, even after the vote to leave during the period from 2016 to 2019, which reached fever pitch in its preparations in 2018, with a range of standalone defence agreements rushed through during a 9-month period, each serving a purpose within a much larger machine. It's unlikely that we could have escaped from becoming part of the EU Defence Union had we stayed in the EU. This would have been a major erosion of what was already really shaky sovereignty for this country within the EU. And of course, with an EU army would have come the need to adhere to a common defence and security policy with major constraints on many foreign policy issues. We've seen a foreshadowing, I would call it, of how the EU would behave as a military power in their unpleasant actions over vaccines, which have been characterized by centralizing power that they didn't previously have over medical issues, lies, incompetence, deceit, and bullying. And this factor, their approach has been missing quite extensively from future thinking on the EU's defence union. But now, faced with one of its greatest ever challenges, the mask, if you'll excuse the medical pun, if it's a pun, the mask has slipped. Mm-hmm. Now, freedom from the EU means freedom in the future, as we've had in the past, to pursue our own global defence policies in our country's interests. European defence is a key part of this, and we achieve this through our membership of NATO and permanent membership of the UN Security Council, as well as bilateral agreements such as between us and France. Now, another potential advantage comes in defence procurement, and that includes probably very importantly warship procurement. And I'm going to dwell a little bit, I'm afraid, in detail on this particular issue. It's not something that's hugely exciting, but I think it's very important at the moment. As a non-EU state, we should have the right to produce and purchase all defence equipment within the EU, should we wish to do so, creating countless jobs as well as bolstering our strategic self-reliance. I say it's a potential advantage because even with Brexit, we don't have that freedom yet. And in fact, I'm sorry to say this, we may never have it. Britain was shoehorned into one of the EU's labyrinthine defence structures at the 11th hour of the UK-EU deal at the end of last year. Less than 2 weeks before we reached the deal with the European, before we reached the deal, the European Defence Fund was slipped quietly into the Horizon Europe programme, which is the EU Scientific Research Initiative, which we'd already agreed to sign up to. The EDF is a central pillar of the EU Defence Union. It is just a few billion euros in size, but this hides far greater political powers contained within it. Official reassurances that we can cherry pick within Horizon Europe does not appear, from what I can see anyway, to be correct. Maintaining the legacy EU defence contract rules, which were brought in to create the EU single market for defence industry, are a legal prerequisite to our membership of these arrangements, which we are effectively signed up to. They prevent us from retaining defence contracts for the UK, except for a small number of sensitive projects. For example, at least 2/3 of our Navy and RFA fleet would not be classed as sensitive projects. The same officials with their pro-EU and rejoiner agendas who've been working to keep us entangled in EU defence arrangements know that integrated defence markets are a powerful pull toward joint procurement and then joint usage. So that's a real problem, I think, that has to be faced up to and acknowledged and hopefully fought against by, certainly in Parliament, I would argue. Just a word on security. Exiting the EU has made this country safer in security terms. I believe the negative effects of loss of direct access to criminal databases has been overstated and can be overcome by our police and intelligence services. In any case, these negatives are outweighed by our new ability to exclude those with criminal and terrorist links from entering the UK, which hitherto was very hard for us to do, given laws on freedom of movement within the EU. With the rise of terrorism across Europe, which is continuing, this will become an increasingly important advantage for us over future years. Finally, there's little doubt that the greatest strategic threat we face today is from China. David mentioned that in his comments. Our position outside the EU allows us to protect ourselves against China without the constraints of EU foreign policy priorities, which, as David mentioned, seem to be drawing closer to China by the day. This means taking a much wider perspective, and we, unlike most European powers, still have the ability to do this, working with other international allies, as well as our European allies. The Prime Minister's proposal to build a new type of alliance during our G7 presidency this year is exactly what I believe is needed, with plans to create the D10 from existing G7 members, plus Australia, South Korea, and India. The intended initial focus is on developing 5G telecommunications technology to reduce dependency on Huawei and the Chinese Communist Party. There is a need to broaden the objectives of the D10 to take on other aspects of Chinese expansionism, which threatens Western democracies everywhere. Just one example of the sort of action necessary is the planned deployment of the UK Queen Elizabeth carrier group to the Pacific. Among other things, it will patrol the South China Sea to defy, on our own behalf and on the behalf of our allies, illegal PRC sovereignty claims there. The alliance, the D10 alliance, should work to push back the authoritarians and radicals across the economic, cultural, political, cyber and technological spectrums and deny them access to critical infrastructure and technology, as well as opportunities for cultural subversion. I just want to say a brief word on NATO. NATO remains a critical alliance for our defence in Europe. The EU Defence Union would undermine the Atlantic Alliance, drawing away resources and duplicating functions. That is exactly what the EU intends in pursuit of their relentless goal of strategic autonomy as a superpower. Although they will continue to pursue their defence union without Britain, its potential is significantly reduced by our absence, which is why they've been working and will continue to work to enmesh us in their defence structures. I mentioned lessons from the EU's inoculation fiasco. When we declined to join the EU vaccinations procurement programme, many people, including Remainers and rejoiners here, warned us that we would suffer for it, losing the big bloc advantages. Events have shown that British nimbleness has outweighed the big bloc. This is not the same thing as defence, but there are comparisons, and history frequently shows us that in warfare, agility and quick action can beat the kind of ponderous, grinding mass which is likely to characterise the EU's approach to defence as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colonel. That was excellent. Very, very important points made. I'd now like to introduce a member, Julian Lewis, Right Honourable Julian Lewis, MP for New Forest East, who is chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee, but is speaking today as twice chairing the House of Commons Defence Committee from 2015 to 2019, where they actually produced 30 inquiry reports, I gather, incredibly busy and productive, and has done a lot to argue the case for Trident, renewal of Trident, nuclear submarines, and indeed to restore the defence budget from 2% to closer to 3%. So thank you for your advocacy on that, Julian. He recently won the election to the Intelligence Security Committee, but lost the whip. I'm sorry to hear that, but I do hope he will be rejoining the Conservative Party very quickly. But he's an excellent chair in both cases, but is talking more from the Defence Committee point of view tonight. So Julian, please give us a few words, if you would.
Well, David, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Update, and that is that I'm pleased to say that the whip was restored to me unconditionally, just in time for me to be able to vote for the departure from the European Union on the basis of the deal on the 30th of December. And it was very nice to be able to do that. And Boris Johnson pointed out that not one of the 28 Spartans, of whom I'm proud to call myself one, who had resisted the Brexit in name only deal that had been offered by his predecessor 3 times, but not one of them voted against our final departure deal. And it was nice to do that back in the Conservative fold.
Right.
So it's a bit frightening when I realize that my initial contact with the Freedom Association goes back over 40 years to 1977, when I made contact with Norris McWhirter, one of the founders of the association, because of our shared concern about what was happening to the Labour Party, which at the time was being infiltrated by an organization that was really the Revolutionary Socialist League, a Trotskyist organization, but was known as the Militant Tendency. And although the campaign we waged, which involved a number of court actions and battles within Labour, local Labour parties that were subject to this form of infiltration and subversion, were deemed at the time to be meant to destabilize Labour, nothing could be further from the truth, because in a successful and safe democracy, you need not only a governing party that is committed, for example, to strong defence, you need a responsible opposition that shares that commitment. And really, if there's any theme to what I've been trying to do both before entering Parliament and since, it's been trying to work across party lines with those people who believe in a strong defence for this country. And in that connection, I can only salute not only Captain Tom, who we're all sad to learn of his passing today, but also people like Richard and Tim, who put themselves in the front line of the armed forces to help protect our country. And of course, when they did that originally, they could not know, and this is relevant to the point I want to get across, they could not know what they were letting themselves in for. They were joining the armed forces in the knowledge that crises arise, but more often than not, the crises which do arise are not predicted significantly in advance, or even sometimes at all. And that has implications for the sort of defense forces you want to have and the sort of investment in defense that you are prepared to make. Let me give you a current analogy, and that is, of course, the disaster of this COVID pandemic. Let's assume that in a matter of months, we will be out of the worst of it. It will have retreated in the way that the terrible influenza pandemic, which killed more people at the end of the First World War than had died in the First World War itself, did. And if somebody then proposes that we should invest very large sums of money when there is no imminent prospect of a pandemic in such things as PPE, or the ability to manufacture future vaccines on a large scale, I think there will be little resistance to any such suggestion. It is as a result of the terrible experience that we've had that people will have learned a hard lesson that if you want to be safe in the future, you've got to invest in the infrastructure to protect yourself in the present. And the same is true of the armed forces, and the same is true of the unpredictability of the threats that we will face. So, for example, when the Cold War came to an end, there was a tendency, after the peace dividend reductions had been implemented, there was a tendency to think that the days of state versus state confrontation had come to an end. And then after 9/11, that tendency was reinforced by the idea that the primary threats that we had to be aware of were international terrorism. And so you had a strange splitting up of the threats of the Cold War, which had seen a combination of a very powerful state with a lot of hard power, namely the Soviet Union, but which also had a pervasive ideology, the ideology of communism, that actually reached out into some of the target societies and attracted sympathizers there, Marxists and fellow travelers, whom the Freedom Association did a lot to shine a spotlight on in the 1970s and 80s. And it reached out to them in the hope of rotting these free societies from within. So you had that lethal combination of a lot of hard power and a pervasive subversive ideology. And that has subsequently split because we ended up finding ourselves in more recent decades facing a pervasive ideology, which is Islamist extremism, but without a great deal of hard power behind it. And on the other hand, we've seen the re-emergence of threats from countries like Russia again, sadly, with a lot of hard power, but without an ideology now that appeals to a potential fifth column in the countries that they're targeting. You could argue perhaps that China combines both, but I don't think that the ideology of Chinese communism has the same appeal in Western societies that Soviet communism did. I don't detect that in any way, shape, or form. On the contrary, the part of Chinese society that has an appeal in our societies and is a danger is the economic appeal of having tremendous investment and goods manufactured very cheaply and in questionable ways and by even more questionable methods. So what I'm trying to get at is, and this was very much the case with the work of the Defence Select Committee during the period that I chaired it, if you can come to an acceptance of the fact that no matter how cleverly you try to predict the future, it is almost always going to take you by surprise, you have to have versatility in your armed forces, you have to have flexibility, and you have to have the potential to reach across a wide divide of potential threats, any one of which could happen, but you cannot know which one is going to happen until you're actually facing it. And that is why we waged this campaign about defense expenditure. And I'll just sum up what the situation was in historical terms very briefly, because we got the House of Commons analysts onto the job, and we got them to plot what had happened in major areas of expenditure over recent decades. And what they found was this: in 1963, we were spending similar sums, about 6% of GDP, on welfare and benefits and on defense. By the time we got to 2017, we were spending 6 times on welfare and benefits what we spent on defense. More recently, in the mid-1980s, we spent similar sums, about 5% of GDP, on education, on health, and on defense. But by the time we were looking at these figures in the period 2017-2018, we were spending 2.5 times as much on education as on defense, and nearly 4 times as much on health as we spend on defense. And if I can show you visually, even through the screen, it's quite clear what was happening to defense expenditure in rapid decline over the years. And this is the expenditure on the National Health Service going in the opposite direction. Now, people say that in looking at the threats that we face in the future, we must recognize that there is a whole new battlefield called the gray zone, consisting of 21st century threats in cyberspace, which are waged at a level that do not cross the threshold that would trigger an armed response by conventional weapons, but nevertheless could bring society to its knees. I accept that that is true. What I do not accept is that in preparing to meet those new threats, it means we must denude the conventional armed forces of their hard power, which is necessary to deter and occasionally to meet the more traditional threats, because the new threats that we face today are additional to, they are not substitute for, the more traditional threats we faced in the past. So to allow time for questions, I'll just sum up like this. I'll say basically, as long as we continue to possess a strategic nuclear deterrent on continuous at-sea patrolling, we can be pretty confident that we will not be subjected to nuclear blackmail or attack. As long as we retain our alliance with the world's largest military power, namely the United States of America, through NATO, we are fairly likely not to be subject to conventional attack. However, there is a danger, and I'm sure this will come up in the questioning, so I'll finish with this point. There is a danger that as a result of the European Union's wish to be an actor in its own right in the defense field, they could undertake commitments to defend other countries that are not automatically covered by the Article 5 American guarantee, which is what keeps NATO countries safe. And the danger could be that we could be drawn by a process of action and reaction unintentionally into a confrontation on behalf of a third-party commitment that had been undertaken by the European Union. And the European Union, whatever they do in defense and whatever we might choose to do to help them, would not be strong enough by itself to deter. That is why, without the involvement of America, NATO would be like Hamlet without the prince. And that, unfortunately, is the sort of structure that the EU wants to construct as part of its super state building project. I would just say, by way of reassurance, do have a look sometime at the government's response in 2018 to the report that we did as the Defence Committee, where we posed a series of questions on the government's plans for a future security partnership with the European Union. The document is called HC 1570, HC House of Commons 1570, and it certainly is full of assurances saying that we can confirm that it's the government's intention to participate in CSDP operations and missions on a case-by-case basis, and only after a decision has been taken autonomously by the United Kingdom to do so. This will be useful ammunition in the future if they ever try to say that we are obliged to go into situations that we would not, in our own interests, choose to involve ourselves with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julian. It's funny you say about flexibility. When I was being trained on basic infantry training in the Scottish moors, mist and wet, and they said, don't worry, there won't be a war like this. It will all be tanks, Soviet tanks. And then 6 months later, we had the Falklands War, and it was very like Scotland in parts and basic infantry training, and they took our Klansman radios and used them down there. So flexibility is a very key lesson. There's a number of questions that people have typed in. I'll just take them, if I may, and also quick fire answers. We're probably allowed to go over about 10 minutes if that's possible, but I don't want to push that. But we're looking at, Gwen Swinburne is asking, what difference will Biden make to defense? I wonder if you could take that. I don't know who wants to take that first.
Can we do 2 or 3 questions together and then we can...
Yeah, okay. I'll group. Brian Anderson asking about, is promised additional government funding getting to the front line? Michael Veal is talking about what can the Royal Navy do actively to enhance British merchant navy trading all around the world, British merchant navy trading all around the world. And I can group this in, I think, Graham Erdley talking about the future of NATO will be under a Biden administration. Will the EU nations pay their 2%, as Trump was asking? I should say, as when I was an MEP, I did actually push a German MEP to increase their contribution from 1.6%, and felt rather concerned afterwards at actually encouraging German rearmament. But that's a different stage. So please fire away on that. Do you want to go first, Colonel, or?
I'm happy to. Yeah, I mean, I think on the Biden question, we're pretty clear on what Biden's attitude is likely to be in general terms, because he was the vice president, he was part of Obama's administration. They had a certain stance, and I think we've seen what it is. I think his defense secretary, General Austin, who I had the pleasure to know in Afghanistan, is a man who is very enthusiastic about alliances, and I think he will be, as well as President Biden, I think General Austin will be looking to put a lot of emphasis on NATO, and I think the same question is going to be coming to national leaders in NATO about how much they spend and don't spend. So I don't think they're going to get off the hook there, because Trump's not breathing down the neck, and equally Obama had the same issues he raised himself. I think there are questions about the Middle East, perhaps more than broader issues, which I think one of the key issues is the Iranian nuclear project, which of course President Obama brought in with the P5+1, brought in the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, which actually served to pave the way to an Iranian nuclear weapon. Unfortunately, President Trump pulled out of it. I think we wanted to pull out of it as well, but didn't want to be seen to go along with Trump and against the more broad EU perspective. But I think that's an area that needs to be of concern to us, because I think, I would slightly disagree with Julian in as much as he says, while we have our own nuclear deterrent, that will keep us safe from nuclear blackmail. I agree with that wholeheartedly in terms of rational actors. I'm not sure if you have a nuclear-armed Iran that mutual assured destruction or anything like it is going to work quite so effectively. So I think that's an area that we need to be slightly more careful of. As far as getting to the front line is concerned, we will have to see. I think a lot of emphasis on funding will be on technology and space projects and cyber. I think that's where a lot of the priority is going to land. And as Julian said quite rightly before, these new capabilities are, as well as hard kinetic capabilities, that we also need. And I believe that it's likely that the army, for example, is going to be cut very soon, significantly cut, in an announcement that will be coming sometime in the spring. So if that is the front line, then no, I don't think those funds are going to get at that front line. I think they go more in the ether where they're needed, but they're also needed on the front line. I don't really have any comments to make on the Navy trading question. You'll be pleased to hear.
Julian,
I go next. Yes, I certainly accept that countries like North Korea and Iran are less stable than the superpowers, but nevertheless, even the most unstable power structures, when it comes to the threat of nuclear annihilation, I think tend to, shall we say, sober up a little bit in the face of what is, and this is why its deterrent effect is so persuasive, the difference between a conventional balance of power is you can have rough equality between the contending conventional forces, and yet through superior generalship or whatever, equipment and so on maybe, but even if it was well balanced, you can never be sure that one side won't completely vanquish the other. The difference with the nuclear weapon is not only is its destruction unacceptable, it is unavoidable. And it's quite interesting, in fact, that I can remember at a time when India and Pakistan were constantly at loggerheads with one another, and they were having serious military clashes. And I remember when one and then the other exploded a nuclear weapon, we were being told in the House of Commons by quite experienced politicians saying, this is a terrible disaster for the world, and it's very much a less safe place. Strangely enough, I think they have had to take their mutual security in a lot steadier fashion, even though they still have issues with each other, since they realized that they had the ability to wipe each other out than before. But it's open to argument. Let's put it one way. There's one thing we can certainly agree on, and that is that any country like ours, any democracy that's foolish enough unilaterally to get rid of its nuclear weapons would be laying itself open to a situation which would be extremely vulnerable. On the question of the difference to be made by Joe Biden, I think I tried to put as good a face as I could on the advent of Trump. I realized that there was at least a possibility that by him taking such a tough line with NATO countries, European NATO countries, on their failure to invest enough in defense, he might do NATO a service by getting them to invest more. But unfortunately, at the back of one's mind all the time was the suspicion that Donald Trump didn't really want America to be out there protecting weaker countries and other democracies at all, and that he was much more in the isolationist tradition of American politics. Now, you can be too interventionist, as Tony Blair demonstrated, and as David Cameron did to some extent in Libya and would have done in Syria as well if a number of us hadn't stopped him. But the alternative is even worse. The extreme alternative of isolationism is even worse, because then you get drawn in to multinational conflicts on terms that are out of your control. And I think Biden is probably much more of an Atlanticist, and we ought to be grateful for that. I hope he will continue to put pressure on the European NATO countries, who should realize that 2% is not a target, it is a minimum. And the problem that I used to have in having these debates in Parliament about what we were spending or not spending on defense was that people kept talking about it as if it was a target, when historically we'd never dropped anywhere near to spending as low as 2%. And the fact that it was even in question was appalling. And by the end, although officially, according to NATO calculations, round about 2018, we were spending 2.1%, but on the basis on which we used to calculate it, we were already down to 1.8%. And so when we're asked, will the additional funding find its way to the front line? The answer has to be a lot of it won't, partly because, as Richard says, it will go into different dimensions, but also there is a pretty huge equipment black hole that if there had not been an injection of money of this magnitude would have led to even more profound cuts than those, regrettably, that we saw in that terrible defence review of 2010. Finally, on the question of whether the Royal Navy has the idea of helping the Merchant Navy in training, it's not something I've heard about, but now that I have, I think I'll put down a parliamentary written question, and the questioner will be able to have a look at my website where there's a section showing those, and he'll be able to see what sort of an answer I get.
That's great. Thank you, Julian. If I may, Tip,
Go ahead.
More questions and ask you.
More questions.
I'll ask you to comment on those totally. But we've got one, Andrew Allison, talking about China being our biggest threat. How do we deal with this threat? And cybersecurity linked to that. Where's the greatest, that's Michael Julian, where's the greatest risk from in cyber security? Is that China and Russia or both? There's also a question on the golden share. Will that be returning? We used to be able before the EU to protect, inverted commas, our defense industry with a golden share. I don't know if that's coming back or not. I'm not sure that's clear. A lot on cyber defense, and then yeah, just in general from Simon Richards, is the emphasis on the NHS and the pandemic going to drain defense money long term? That's also an issue. And regionally, can defense benefit the north of England? I hope there's quite a sort of mix of questions, but Tim, do you want to go?
Yes, I take some of those up. I mean, I think, Russia seems to be the more immediate threat. Although, I think Russia's frankly a country in decline. It's impoverished. It's got a declining population. We do have a armored battle group in Estonia with about 800 or 900 troops there as part of NATO. China, I think, is the more long-term threat. I think it was Colonel Richard who mentioned the South China Sea. They're building military bases on coral reefs in international waters, and I think China has global ambitions. And I think, unlike Russia, China trades with the West a lot, which creates some sort of dependence upon them. And also, it does have a growing and go-ahead economy, unlike Russia, which sort of seems to be going backwards economically. In terms of cybersecurity, this is a huge area, and it's not just Army, Navy, Air Force anymore. Now, as we've said, it's drones, it's satellites, it's cyber and IT. In fact, last year, Russia launched a huge cyber attack on Estonia. And I think it was Julian Lewis who mentioned this whole idea of grey war, where the line between conflict and peace is blurred, and nowhere is that more apparent, I think, than in the eastern Ukraine, where you've got a combination of targeted assassinations, unattributable car bombings, cyber and hacking attacks, troops with no markings. Who are they? Are they Russian? Are they a locally recruited militia? That kind of thing. And so I think cyber is just a huge area, and something we're really going to have to look at. As for the monies we're having to spend on the NHS and lockdown, I mean, it's got to be done, I suppose. But really, you could weep, couldn't you? Because that money, our national debt now is over 2 trillion, plus PFI, plus the unfunded public sector pension schemes, etc. This is money that really could have gone into the government's very praiseworthy levelling up agenda, and of course on defence. Although, the extra money for defence is very welcome, but as Julian Lewis quite rightly points out, the truth is, without it, we would have had to have had major cuts in our capability.
Yes, Julian, do you want to take that now?
Okay, well, on the question of the golden share, I think has always been the case. I'm not an expert in this area, but I think it's always been the case that in strategically relevant British industries, that it was felt that it was necessary to keep a controlling interest. That has, in a number of cases, continued to be the case. I would encourage people to have a look at what's going on in Parliament at the moment with something called the National Security and Investment Bill, which is designed to make sure that the entry into strategic sectors of our industry and our economy generally, as happened almost unnoticed by Huawei until they had got to such a position of entanglement that it became very contentious to argue about removing them. So there are a whole host of arrangements now that are being put in place, which I welcome, and which should make it much more likely that we will have a degree of safety and autonomy in strategically important industries in the future. I'm not sure that that necessarily is related to our departure from the EU, because it applies even more importantly to some of our adversaries who are not members of the EU at all. I don't think anybody seriously suggests that this colossal expenditure on the pandemic is going to have to be taken back anytime soon in immediate cuts in other areas, because you could cut other areas of our national life all you like, and it would still only make a very small dent in this colossal debt that we have built up. And I think I'm right in saying, in fact, I'm pretty sure I am, that the announcement of the significant increase in defence expenditure, though it's still a long, long way below 3%, the announcement of that came even after we had already started to lay out these enormous quantities of money to pay for this crisis. So I'm afraid this will be something on a par with the sort of debt that was run up in the course of fighting and paying for the Second World War, and it will be with us and future generations for many years until it is gradually reduced. I'm not going to say anything about my estimates about China at the moment, because the committee that I currently chair, and this is publicly known, is engaged at present in a major study of China, and therefore I think it's better to wait to see what that produces at the end of the process. But in talking about Russia, I couldn't help thinking when we heard today that Navalny is being tried at the moment for breach of his bail conditions on the grounds that he didn't report in as he was supposed to do, because he was actually in Germany in hospital because he'd been poisoned by the Russian state. And that really did remind me of what was said about the practice that when somebody was shot down, a young person was shot down trying to climb over the Berlin Wall, the East German authorities sent his grieving family a bill for the bullets that had been used to kill him. So it's worth just reminding ourselves sometime of the mentality of the people who are in command of countries that are very powerful indeed, and that do not love us, but which can be made to respect us as long as we are showing people that we are too strong to be trifled with impunity. And that really is what the concept of deterrence is all about.
Thank you, Julian. And then finally, Richard, just one final one. We've had David Desroches from the National Defence University in Washington, DC, is just asking about whether the EU project duplicates NATO's HQ. Whether you could just add that to your response, if you would, Richard.
Yeah, I'll comment on a few of those. First of all, the China issue. I think that there was a hell of a lot of complacency about China over many years, and in that time they gained a huge amount of ground against us. And I'm not talking about military victories or anything like that, of course. I'm talking about within our infrastructure, in our society, in our economy. And it was really, I think, only when the coronavirus descended upon us, did people begin really seriously to wake up when they saw China's culpability for allowing that virus to spread, irrespective of where it came from and how it began, but the fact that China effectively was grossly irresponsible in allowing it to spread out. So now there is an awakening, and I think, you know, President Trump certainly was seized by it, and I'm pretty sure President Biden will be also seized by it, as is our Prime Minister, I hope. And we, you know, there are so many different facets to this problem of China. The question of cyber was raised as well, and of course China is a huge cyber threat. It just currently, I mean, we've seen numerous cyber attacks which are supposedly come from China, and no doubt they're laying the ground for a huge amount more in so many different ways. And I think, you know, that's one reason, and not just China, of course, Russia and other countries, but that's one reason why money does need to be spent on cyber defense. We've seen, you know, we saw some lessons recently when Iran attempted a serious cyber attack against Israel's water supply, and Israel had the defenses in place adequate to prevent it from being serious. But then they repaid the favor by paralyzing one of Iran's ports for a number of days by a counter cyber attack. And we've seen the effect they've had on setting back Iran's nuclear program through cyber war. So I think, you know, these relatively recent examples show us the potency cyber in the defence field, as well as many others. But yeah, and in terms of dealing with China, how do we deal with it? Well, first of all, we recognise the problem, and the Intelligence and Security Committee will no doubt come up with their view on it in due course if it's published. I don't know, but we have to, you know, as long as, first of all, we've got to recognise the problem. I think many people now do. Secondly, I think we have to, as well as preparing our own defences against China, we have to support our allies. And of course, Australia has been bullied relentlessly by China recently. My advice to everybody watching this is buy Australian wine, because the Chinese, I know it's a big ask, but please buy and drink Australian wine. It's the least you can do for your allies. But yeah, I mean, that, you know, Australia supporting Taiwan. Obviously, Taiwan is very much in their sights. Hong Kong, all of these other countries that are actively being threatened by China. There are many more, but I know you don't have all night, so I won't go into any greater detail on all that. I think the only other comment I'd make is on the duplication of NATO by the EU. Yes, I think an EU defence union will actually actively attempt to undermine NATO. And it will probably start off doing this by duplicating NATO efforts, which means that resources they're not going to spend more money on both NATO and their own EU force. They will simply take money away from NATO, and NATO will suffer. And when, you know, again, I think a decline could be in sight with NATO if that undermining of NATO's capability by EU countries is seen by the US as being, you know, even less of an investment in NATO than we have today, and whether that would then lead the US to consider pulling out of NATO, I don't know. But I think, yeah, I think the answer to the question is that there would be a lot of duplication with a view to winding down, I think, on the EU's part, winding down NATO's influence, and of course the terrible influence of the US, as seen from some EU capitals. I think that will that would be a real problem for NATO.
Well, can I just thank all the speakers tonight for excellent contributions and very well informed ones, and for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't go through all of them. There's quite a few tonight, but that shows the depth of interest from those attending. So thank you very much for supporting the Freedom Association. Don't forget you can join or contribute with the treasurer sitting there on tfa.net. But thank you so much, Richard, Julian, Tim, for your contributions tonight, and everyone for listening in. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Cheers.
Good night.